Welcome to FODI Digital, a weekend of online conversation about the dangerous realities that surround us, albeit at a safe distance. My name is Simon Longstaff. I'm Executive Director of the Ethics Centre and co-founder of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. Like so many other festivals from around the world, FODI was cancelled by a government decision to lock down the community just before it was due to be presented. So this weekend we pick up some of those conversations that might have been presented during the course of the conversation and also take account of the new pressures being presented by COVID-19 on so many topics that really matter. In today's first session, The Truth About China, a panel of China watchers are going to interrogate our infatuation with China, the fact that we may have been seduced by economic prosperity, only to find that the reality may be somewhat more challenging than originally supposed. Apart from the general change in circumstances, the escalation in global tensions from around the world caused by this pandemic are now bringing all prospects into sharper focus. Now, a little later, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd will be presenting by video in an interview filmed earlier with Peter Hartcher. And this will be followed by a panel of experts, Yaqui Wang, Yat-Sen Li, and Vicky Xiuzhong, who will be in conversation with Peter Hartcher. So turning now to former Prime Minister and inaugural President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Kevin Rudd, in conversation with the editor, the international editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Hartcher.
Kevin Rudd, welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. Let me begin by asking you how it comes to be that for a man who spends most of his time in New York, we happen to have the pleasure of your company while we're all huddled here together in the pandemic.
Well, good day, Peter. Good to be with you. And for those who are part of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, let's be dangerous together. Well, reasonably dangerous anyway. Why am I back in Oz? Well, I went back to work in New York where I run an American think tank. In fact, I've been there since I came second in the last Australian federal elections, not the last ones, but the 2013 elections. But having been back at work in January, February, March, and finally persuaded the powers that be within my own institution to allow all my staff to A, work from home and B, get off the New York subway. My wife, Therese, said, get thee hence. So out of New York and back to the People's Republic of Queensland. And I've been in initially isolation and then subsequently with Therese since about the middle of March.
So New York was an even more dangerous idea than Brisbane. Can I ask you about this pandemic, which none of us expected to be in, but which we find ourselves in? What's it revealing to us, do you think, Kevin, about China, where it began, about the US, and the world order, perhaps?
Yeah, I've been talking to a range of folk, both in China and the United States, about this, people who are seeking to be analytical about it. And it's a tough question. It's a bit like the COVID-19 crisis has turbocharged and accelerated the speed, timeline, and focus associated with pre-existing underlying structural trends in the international order. So what do I mean by all that? We all know there's been geopolitical tension between the Americans and the Chinese prior to this occurring, the trade war just being the most recent example. Secondly, on top of that, we also know that China has itself become increasingly assertive in terms of the prosecution of its national interests, both within our region, but also globally. But thirdly, with this event, this pandemic, we've had an eruption of, let's call it, new factors. In the case of the Americans, what I see is a damaged America coming out of this COVID-19 crisis as people look to the appalling state of the American domestic response, the appalling nature of presidential leadership, but more importantly for the rest of the world, a complete lack of interest on the part of Washington in terms of leading a global recovery, either in public health or in the economy. But you know something? Often people stop with their analysis there, and they think, therefore, America down, China up. Well, actually, no. My own interpretation is that China emerges from this pandemic, this COVID-19 crisis, equally damaged and probably more so. Not least because of the origins of the virus coming out of Wuhan, also the series of unanswered questions about notification within China and through the WHO to the rest of the world, and frankly some clumsy attempts by the Chinese wolf warrior diplomats to manage the international messaging around this. So where do we end up? Both these great powers, I think, more rapidly than any of us would have anticipated, significantly weakened by this event. But the danger is the institutions of global governance have also been weakened. The WHO, just a classic case in point, where it becomes almost the battleground for binary geopolitics. And so my greatest anxiety is coming out of this crisis, we don't end up with China up or America up. We end up with both down, the institutions of global governance weakened, and a trend to what I describe as global anarchy.
So we've seen an America under Donald Trump that's not really interested in global leadership. We see a China, from your analysis just there, that's going to be having its reach for global leadership slipping further away. What is this? Is this a world without a leader? Or is there a prospect that on the other side of the US presidential election, we may see America expressing interest in the concept of world leadership once again?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the classic sort of description of these things, in the period after the fall of the Soviet Union, 1991, we moved to a unipolar world. That's called a G1, the group of one, called the United States. Then we had an emerging literature in the first decade of this century around about the possibility of a G2. That is, United States and China between them through the institutions of global governance like the G20, beginning to, as it were, manage the institutions of global governance, albeit coming from different regions, different systems, different traditions. Then, of course, the geopolitics of all that began to erupt for various reasons. But, you know, rather than this then becoming a new China-dominated world, or the resuscitation of the American order necessarily, as a friend and colleague of mine in New York, Ian Bremmer from Eurasia Group, has described it, we don't end up with G2 or G1, we end up with G0. And that is a drift towards what I again described before as anarchy. Could the Democrats, if they win in November, reconstitute this? I actually believe they can. Biden is often derided as being, you know, old and rambling and all the rest of it. But he is likely to be smart enough to assemble a first-class international policy team, both on international economy and security and foreign policy. And enough of them are conscious enough of where the American drift in global leadership has got to, and the China challenge has got to, I think, reconstitute this. There's enough intellectual awareness of the challenge. The question is, will they have the political capability of doing it, which of course depends on, do they win?
Mm. So what's the outlook for the relationship between China and the US post-pandemic? You've described it in an essay you wrote for Foreign Affairs Journal that I think you described it as not Cold War 2.0, but Cold War 1.5. What does that mean, and what should we expect?
Well, if you look at the language around the Cold War, those of us old enough, like Harcher, you and I, can actually remember the last Cold War. We belong to the Paleolithic generation who can remember these things. But, you know, it had a few characteristics. One, mutually assured destruction in the level of nukes. 2, zero economic engagement. 3, third country proxy wars. And 4, basically, an ideological cleavage. Now, prior to the events of COVID or prior to the trade war, sure, there was an element of the nuclear competition between the two countries, although the Chinese arsenal is small by Soviet standards, but it's still capable of a second strike effect. But what we now have is, through the beginnings of economic decoupling, a removal of that economic ballast in the US-China relationship, which has historically differentiated it from the characteristics of the US-Soviet relationship in the old Cold War. And then you've got an emerging serious ideological competition, not between communism and capitalism so much as between the authoritarian state versus the democratic state. Third country proxy wars, not yet, but have a look at the Belt and Road Initiative and whether that gets progressively militarized in the future. Open question. So why do I pick on Cold War 1.5? There's enough by way of trend lines to cause us to think that we're entering into a new period, which turns on its head the assumptions that we had about the US-China relationship from the time that Deng Xiaoping returned to the leadership in the late 70s and frankly rebooted China for the subsequent 40 years. It's at that sort of inflection point.
So one of the details that's likely, I mean, this is detailed in that very big picture you just sketched, but the trade deal between the US and China, we shouldn't expect that to be ratified and acted upon anytime soon in that case.
Well, it's a really interesting, complex question, Peter, because I was talking to my colleagues in New York about this just 2 days ago, and my vice president of the Asia Policy Institute is the former deputy USTR, Wendy Cutler. So she follows this professionally. She knows the entrails. Now, her technical advice to me is that here we are, 4 months into the year, and at a mechanical level, the Chinese side are in fact implementing the provisions of the Phase 1 trade deal. Now, we don't know yet whether all elements can be executed, particularly the $200 billion mandatory purchasing order of American goods by the Chinese, which Trump insisted upon, nor do we know the future of the Phase 2 deal. But as for that trade agreement, so far, frankly, it's being adhered to at a technical level. So we might ask ourselves, why is that the case? I think it's because Xi Jinping knows that China has a massive economic challenge on its hands. The economy has been deeply damaged by the corona crisis, and prior to that, damaged somewhat by the trade war. And I think the predisposition in Beijing at present is to try and restabilize the economic relationship, because China's not yet strong enough to sail alone. Remember, 40% of Chinese GDP is still the traded sector of their economy.
So with this big picture you're forecasting with a G0 in terms of leadership and anarchy, as you've described in the global order, how does this look to Australia? And how does Australia survive in the midst of what you've described as anarchy?
Well, a trend towards anarchy is the term I've used in the article I've just penned for Foreign Affairs magazine, and it's consistent with my language about Cold War 1.5. So what does it mean for third countries like us? I think, the first thing that we in the People's Republic of Australia have got to work out, joke in case anyone thinks I'm being pro-communist, is that we're not Robinson Crusoe here. Most significant countries in the world who find themselves jammed in the US-China relationship are going through parallel dilemmas. We might be, as I've said before, the first Western canary down the Chinese mine shaft in terms of this national experience, but frankly, there are a whole lot of others as well, and not all of them Western democracies. I think the second thing is the dilemmas we face, to be fair to Mr. Morrison, who is now the Prime Minister, are now sharper than I faced. But it was still sharp when I was Prime Minister. We constantly were faced with decisions which were seen in Beijing as hostile to their interest. And you may recall back then, I was routinely attacked for failing to manage the Australia-China relationship by being too hardline in pushing back against the Chinese. But it is becoming sharper, and that's objectively the case. Therefore, for Australian policy in the future, my own judgment is to execute an appropriate level of balance for the future. We're going to have to, A, pick our disagreements with Beijing carefully to work out what is essential as opposed to non-essential by way of national policy agreements. B, where we do have different sets of interests of a significant nature with the Chinese, do not sail alone, but in fact construct effective coalitions with other states, both within the region and beyond, so that we are not speaking with a single voice.
So on those 2 points,
that, try and prosecute your other interests.
So on those 2 points, the first one being the sharpening of the confrontation, really, with China now that China's ambassador to Australia has threatened pretty substantial economic sanctions because of the Morrison quest for an international inquiry into the origins of the virus. How does Morrison, how does the country handle this? You've said elsewhere that it would be pathetic to walk away now. You've been critical of the way Morrison got into this, but having got here, you've said he can't walk away. So looking to the future, what are the, as you put it, fights that he should pick and the ones he should leave alone? And on your second theme, which is that Australia isn't walking alone and shouldn't try to walk alone, what are the like-minded countries, or at least countries with shared interests, with which Australia could most prospectively form partnerships?
Yeah, well, those two great sets of questions. I think on the question of what constitutes a balanced relationship with Beijing in the future, I think I said this, something similar at the time of the launch of your quarterly essay in Parliament House in Canberra at the end of last year. Seems like an eternity ago. But in my own relationship with the Chinese leaders, I was always very frank about two things. Number one, Australia is an ally of the United States. It ain't going to change. Just get used to it. You may not like it, but there's historical reasons for it, and there are future reasons for it as well. Number two, we're a liberal democracy. We believe in universal human rights. Guess what? That's not going to change either. And I know you don't like that, but that's just who we are. Number three, however, we have a whole bunch of bilateral economic interests which are mutually advantageous that we can prosecute. And number four, there are institutional arrangements in global governance through the G20 and other institutions where we can and should collaborate, whether it's climate change, dare I say it, pandemic management, and dare I say it also, future global financial management as the size of the Chinese economy continues to be a bigger footprint. So that's my kind of approach to how you would have a framework within which to construct a balanced arrangement and be absolutely clear with the Chinese that there are our four principles and don't walk away from them. On the second point, which is who are our natural allies, apart from our friends across the Tasman, the bottom line is this. I think there is a group of countries within the G20 who wish to sustain and enhance the institutions of global governance and do so in a manner which is consistent with the sorts of universal values and common interests which we in Australia would share with them. Who might they be? Among the Europeans, I would point to significant countries like Germany, France, the United Kingdom, depending on which way Boris wants to take the UK, even Brussels itself. In our part of the world, the South Koreans, also the Japanese, I would say also the Singaporeans and the Indonesians, though the Singaporeans are not members of the G20. India, question mark, because it's never historically exhibited a huge interest in the institutions of global governance. But then throw in the Canadians, as well as in Latin America, the Mexicans and the South Africans in the continent. And I think you start to have a critical mass of interests across multiple jurisdictions where you can get behind what I describe as the necessary support multilaterally to keep the institutions of global governance functioning properly.
We've got close to the entire G20 membership there, I think, except notably it excludes Saudi Arabia and China.
But your question was, how do you establish a critical mass of, as it were, liberal democracies from multiple, in my case, multiple geographies and Muslim states as well, like Indonesia, around this critical central question of how do we triage the essential elements of the global rules-based system and the institutions which underpin it, both the UN, WHO, WTO, UNHCR, and the rest, not to mention what happens at the level of financial collaboration through the Financial Stability Board. or global financial markets. You get those countries behind that, collectively they've got some critical mass, but they've got to need to start to act that way, and not as just a gaggle of 10 separate press statements, which is partly my criticism of Morrison's half-baked idea about the independent global inquiry. If you're serious about it, Scotty from marketing, get on the phone. I used to do this all the time. Ring your mates in the G20 and say, listen, Cobber, how about you come on board with us if we do this? That way, when you put out your proposal, you've got a critical mass behind it. Instead, this was a Morrison thought bubble, hastily cobbled together then as an idea, and then a scramble to try and get some international support. I use that as just a case study.
Well, we could go all day, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Kevin, thanks for joining us, and we'll let you return to sheltering in place in sunny Brisbane.
Well, may the day prove to be dangerous and exciting for all of you.
Not too dangerous. Thanks, Kevin.
Not too dangerous. All the best. Thanks, Peter.
Well, we can go from there to discussing some of the dangerous ideas that Kevin has put to us, and while we're hiding from the dangerous reality outside, let me introduce, to start with, our panel. We're privileged to have an expert, eminent panel of three to join us, starting with Yaqui Wang. Yaqiu is a China researcher at the Human Rights Watch in New York, where she's coming to us live. Welcome, Yaqiu. Yaqiu, unlike me, has a proper qualification in international relations. She has a master's degree from George Washington University. Next, we have Vicky Xiuzhong. Vicky is a researcher for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and in particular, its Cyber Policy Centre. Vicky worked as a journalist for the New York Times in Sydney. She's also worked for the ABC, where her fields included the Chinese diaspora communities. She's researched a range of China-related subjects, including the One Belt, One Road initiative. Welcome, Vicky. And
thank you.
Thirdly, we have Jason Yat-Sen Li. Jason is also joining us from Sydney, where I'm happy to be sharing the same warm morning. Jason is a lawyer who is currently the chairman of the investment group Vantage Asia. He's also managing director of corporate advisory firm YSA. YSA specialises in complex cross-border China-related merger and acquisition and capital raising. Jason has a list of entanglements and commitments longer than my arm, so I'm not going to try to go all the way to the end of the list, but he is a fellow of Sydney University Senate. He is also involved with the Sydney Committee for the Australian Chamber Orchestra, and he's a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. I think that's enough to introduce you, Jason. Jason, welcome. I'm going to start asking the first question for our panel to Yaqiu. Yaqiu, we heard Kevin Rudd there projecting that it would be a very damaged America that emerges from this pandemic. He also said that this was an America that was going to be accelerating into its geopolitical confrontation with China. From where you sit in New York, do you see a damaged America emerging from this? Do you see a turbocharging of its confrontation with China?
I think so. Because, I mean, we have all seen on the news of the two sides accusing each other for bringing the virus. So I think, you know, from being in the US, this is very clear. There were already a lot of tension, and it was already, the relations are already deteriorating, and this has been exacerbated by the virus. And I think, you know, Donald Trump is using China, is blaming China in order to shift, you know, the blame on himself. So they have the theory of the Wuhan lab and all that stuff, which, you know, has been questioned. And the rhetoric, you know, I follow the U.S. government's all kinds of Twitter accounts, and it's very clear that the rhetoric has become more and more, you know, harsh on China. So I absolutely think this is the deterioration of the relation will continue after the pandemic.
Well, Vicky, Kevin also foresaw a damaged China emerging from the pandemic. Vicky, how do you see that?
Yes, I think that will absolutely be the case. I think right now what China has been trying to do is, it has largely gotten the pandemic situation under control, and is trying to shake off the blame. It's trying to, claim that, the virus didn't originate from China. It's trying to say China shouldn't be held responsible for it. And it's trying to shift the narrative to say that, China is actually acting as a global leader during this pandemic. It's actually trying to take, what would be a disaster, a PR disaster for China, as an opportunity to expand its influence and to exert its influence around the world. And that, includes sending care packages to developing countries, and also developed countries like, Italy. But the results so far have been really mixed. These soft power diplomacy efforts have not entirely been welcomed around the world. There are accusations of faulty equipment. There are spats between, for example, Thailand and China over other issues that just let's say didn't paint China or the Chinese netizens and the Chinese media in a positive light, that sort of canceled out whatever effort China has been put into aid. And also with the damaged economy, it's very, I would argue it's almost impossible China would come out of this with the victory that it hopes.
Jason, the overarching picture that we saw Kevin sketch was one of a trend to global anarchy and no leadership. He called it G0. How do you see a country like Australia, Jason, navigating a world trending to anarchy? And Kevin was very confident that one of the anchors of Australian policy during this would be the alliance with the US. Do you think that's right? Do you think that the alliance can withstand the Trump administration and what's to come?
Yeah, good questions, Peter. I think one of the most salient things coming from Kevin's presentation was this point about the failure of superpower leadership, really. I mean, he was basically saying neither the US nor China really covered themselves in glory over this exercise. And it's kind of disappointing, from the perspective of Australians. These are the superpowers. We look to the superpowers for global leadership. And, it's not quite Independence Day, it's not quite an alien invasion coming down, but if it doesn't take a global pandemic with hundreds of thousands of deaths to bring the world together to cooperate, one really wonders what will. And so that's the context. And what does Australia do in this context? I think that it's often framed in terms of we need to choose. Do we choose the US or do we choose China? I don't think that's particularly helpful. I think if we look at this big strategic rivalry between the US and China as a major challenge, not just in terms of how we handle this pandemic, but as Kevin was alluding to international peace and security. These are the foundations that have kept us the world relatively free of mass armed conflict, at least since the Second World War. And as this stuff unravels, it leaves us in really uncharted waters, thus G0 and anarchy. And I know today's the 75th anniversary of VE Day, and it reminds us of what the objective should be here. To your question about the US alliance, look, I think this is not specifically a COVID-19 thing. I think that there were pressures around that beforehand from the erratic sort of behavior of President Trump. And I think, as somebody once said, I don't think it's a matter of Australia stepping back or choosing to leave the alliance. I think it's more whether the United States chooses to back away from the alliance.
Yaqiu, human rights is your field. What's the outlook, do you think, for human rights in China during and after this pandemic? I mean, you follow this closely, most of us don't. Has there been any change in Xi Jinping's policy on domestic human rights? And what do you think the future holds? And if I can just broaden the question out for you while you're at it, Yaqiu, beyond human rights in China, the state of democracy. I mean, China is portraying its response to the pandemic as a demonstration of a superior model of governance, that democracy is a failing system of governance, that authoritarianism a la China is the way of the future. Do you think democracy itself will suffer in that sort of accelerating contest that Kevin Rudd has sketched for us?
Human rights in China has been deteriorating for the past 10 years. I would say, around Beijing Olympic time. And the deterioration has accelerated since Xi Jinping came to power. I mean, from this pandemic, something are very clear: the censorship that is going on, the surveillance that is going on, and the harassment and detention of people who try to criticize the government that is going on. All those things have been going on before, and I think they are going to those human rights issues are going to continue to deteriorate. In terms of the Chinese government's narrative of our system, our authoritarian way of doing things is superior at beating the virus. My answer to that is that first, we don't know actually what happened in China. What's happening in China? The government said that there are about 3,500 people died in Wuhan, but many people estimated, by looking at how many people were cremated at funeral homes, the number could be 10 times higher. So we don't know what actually happened because of the censorship. Anybody who said all the sufferings, all the bad stories we hear on the internet by the media are just a tip on the iceberg. So there are a lot of stuff we just don't know. So I wouldn't say the Chinese government has successfully contained the virus, because there's just so many things we don't know. But I think what has been unfortunately successful is how the Chinese, through propaganda and censorship, a lot of people inside China actually believed, because of the Communist Party's leadership, we made it very hard but necessary sacrifices. We have beaten the virus. So, I've been talking to people in the past several weeks, just this sense of pride in the country, this sense of, we have sacrificed, we have achieved something that, we have come out of a very sad situation victoriously. This is very, I think it's quite shared among the population. So Kevin Rudd was saying, China might come out of this not, victoriously because of all their, all the issues that they're having. But I think domestically, the Chinese Communist Party has sold the story quite well. But I agree with Vicky that I don't think internationally speaking they won after of this COVID-19 thing.
Vicky, one of your aspects that I failed to mention in the introduction is that you also do a sideline a very good sideline in comedy. I won't ask you to critique Kevin Rudd's attempts at comedy, but I will ask you, if you could for us, to respond to his concept that Australia has to be careful about the fights it picks with China. to work out which fights really matter and which don't. So 2 parts to that, please, Vicky. First, is the Scott Morrison decision to pursue an international independent inquiry into the origins and responses to the virus a fight that Australia should be picking? And what are the issues that you would say are the priorities for Australia to continue its confrontations or to step up new ones with China? And what are the ones that Australia really should try to leave alone?
Thank you, Peter. And I won't spend too much time critiquing Mr. Rudd's comedy skills. And I do largely agree with him that it is it is determined at how we are in an alliance with the United States. We all have strategic competitions with China, so that is very much of a reality for by now. In terms of which battles we're going to pick in the lead, and is we have always been trying to carefully tread this so-called middle path, right? And we're trying to get pick some battles and leave some, and get some economic gains and compromise on some fronts. But this is where I would love to offer a very dangerous idea, and that is the middle path for Australia in its dealing with China. Incredible, and at times it's just so far under. It's just almost impossible. So they did. Australia does need to place its ethics and values at the forefront of its decision making on China, and move now to lessen out economic dependency on this, to be honest, rogue state. I think that is a main battle we need to pick. And this just reminds me of, Malcolm Turnbull said in his book, which I read and did not pirate, that the Australian business community will never support a government that takes a harder line on China because their economic fortune are too closely tied to Chinese interests. And so any Australian leader who takes the decisive step to choose integrity over possible prosperity will need to be very courageous to do that. And the truth is, everyone knows deep down that this is the right thing to do. And there are several steps to lessen our economic dependency on China. But there's one thing I will mention, is that we are very fearful of China's coercive diplomacy tactics. They have threatened to cut down Australia's export of wine and beef and iron ore and all of that. But we really have to be mindful. My think tank, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, we've been doing this ongoing research on coercive diplomacy of China. And we have recorded more than 200 cases of these little tricks all over the world. And it's yet to be published, but when people read it, they will be surprised how many of these threats have actually been materialized. A lot of these are just, to be honest, bluff. And it's key, like Mr. Rudd said, that democracies do form, this critical math in terms of economic, in terms of tariff, in terms of import, export. We have to form this alliance to sort of like counter these coercive diplomacy tactics. And that sort of battles, as well as, an independent inquiry into COVID, are equally important and critical for the, not for just for now, but for the future. Because, when we're looking back, when 20 years, 30 years from now, we're looking at Australia and we're asking ourselves, did we do the right thing at the right time? Did we side with a fascist state? Did we side with an imperialist power? We've had so many shameful episodes in the history of this country, and we don't need more of them.
We're running very short on time, but if I could ask you, Jason, briefly, please, a two-part question. Do you think that the scenario for Australia that Vicky sketched is viable, that Australia has the political will and has the ability to step away from its heavy trade dependence on China, or do you think our sovereignty is already hostage to China's economic interests? And a second part, I know this is a lot to pack into a 1 minute answer, Jason, but how do you see the Australian Chinese community coping with these sort of pressures? Is it getting squeezed, and do we need to do more to try and protect our own citizens?
It's a big question to answer in 1 minute. Let me be really quick. I think we can balance our economic and our sovereignty interests, bearing in mind that the strength of our economy actually goes to our sovereignty. If our economy goes completely pear-shaped and is destroyed, it doesn't really help our national security, and it doesn't really serve our sovereignty. So our economic interest is a key part of our national sovereignty, I would argue, and we have to be smart about that, and we have to be realistic about that while standing up for our values. Going to, I guess, Chinese Australians here as well, it's a critical part of standing up for our values. Whatever people think about the Chinese Communist Party and our relationship with China, I would urge everybody not to take that out on Chinese Australians or people of Chinese heritage who live in Australia. Because if we start doing that, we start undermining the values that Vicky was talking about and the values that make Australia strong.
Well, we've had wall-to-wall dangerous ideas there. Guys, we're out of time, unfortunately, because you're a fascinating group and I'd love to keep going, but time won't allow. So please just let me thank, on behalf of all the audience, our panelists, Vicky Xiu. We've also got, Jason Yat-Sen Li and Yaqui Wang. Many thanks.
The Festival of Dangerous Ideas and FODI Digital is presented by the Ethics Centre. Our purpose is to bring ethics to the centre of everyday life through public experiences, education, thought leadership, advocacy, consulting and leadership programs. As a non-profit organisation, every single dollar is invested in pursuit of this purpose. Thanks to our donors and partners who help to make our programs happen. And you can donate via the website. Thank you.